Welcome to this new PILS lecture on measuring and modeling agricultural technology adoption, which is, as we just heard, also the topic of, or one of the topics in core project 6 in PhenoRob. Here's the agenda for today. I'd like to first talk about what we mean when we talk about technology adoption, why it's relevant, and then explain why this is an interesting problem to think about before I actually start talking about measuring and modeling adoption. And I've learned from the Talks That Don't Suck series that you should tell your audience before what they should learn. So maybe you've thought about this question already. Why are economists making it always seem more complicated than it is? Actually, it's sometimes more complicated than it seems. And I hope you can appreciate that after this talk. You might also pick up some economist jargon that could be helpful at the dinner table here and there. And you might, and that's perhaps one of the key objectives of this lecture series, identify some opportunities for collaborations with economists within and outside PhenoRob. So why is it important to talk about agricultural technology adoption? It's actually one of the most frequently studied issues in agricultural economics, and it is directly linked to economic, social, and environmental impacts of agriculture. That's why we've seen an increase in the annual publications on this topic all over the world, in all parts of the world. This is an issue, including in Germany, and of course also in PhenoRob, because if farmers don't adopt our technologies or new technologies, then these technologies cannot have an impact. So there's a direct correlation between adoption and uptake of technologies and the environmental, social, and economic impacts they could have on our society and beyond. And that's, of course, why it's so relevant. So let's start with the definition of adoption. It sounds simple, but it is actually a bit more complicated. So adoption is often defined as the decision to use a given technology. But what does use mean? So for how long am I using something? Do I use it every year, for example, or am I just trying it out 1 or 2 years? On how many of my hectares on the farm I'm using it? Is it just, in the mowing robot in the backyard, or is it something that I use on all my various plots? How intensively do I use it? How frequently in the year? Every 2 weeks or just once? So all that is a question that you have to answer when you look at a certain adoption setting and want to find out whether someone is using or not, or has made a decision to use a given technology or not. Now, another perhaps more contentious, important definition that we have to discuss is the definition of technology. So non-economists usually would associate some tool or a machine with the technology, but economists actually refer to technologies as a way to combine inputs to transform them into outputs. And to explain that, here's a small example. So you can produce grains by combining 10 units of labor and 1 unit of capital when you do it manually, or you can produce the same amount of grain by combining 1 unit of labor with 10 units of capital. And these are just 2 inputs. There are many others. Think of knowledge, for example, that must go into this calculation. And then you see that, you can describe different types of technologies in terms of how inputs are combined to produce some output. Why is this interesting or relevant to do it this way? It's because economists also think about efficiency a lot. So of course you can combine 10 units of labor and 1 unit of capital to produce 5 tons of grain, but some farmers manage to produce 10 tons. And this is not because they have better soils or better weather. This is because they are more efficient in combining this. And this is one important aspect that economists always have in mind when they think about the use and impact of technologies. So keep in mind, when economists talk about technologies, they not necessarily always think about a certain machine or a tool, but they think about how inputs are combined to create outputs, and different combinations imply the use of tools or machines in different ways. Just to give you a simple framing or a simple perspective on how you could think about technology adoption. all of us might agree probably that profitability is important, so no one wants to adopt a non-profitable technology. So one of the first things we could do when we think about a new technology is to calculate whether it's profitable. Yeah? So you would list all the inputs and outputs and calculate the costs and the revenues, and you will find that manual weeding in this example here gives you a lower profit than mechanical weeding if the costs and benefits align as they do in this particular example. And then you could predict, well, mechanical weeding is more profitable, so all farmers will adopt mechanical weeding. The fact of the matter is that this is not necessarily taking place. If you look in reality, and researchers before us have studied this quite a bit and came up with this representation of adoption dynamics over time. So you often find the so-called early adopters or innovators to be the ones who start using a certain technology. And then over time, you see that others follow suit, but that takes time. So those that, the last ones that adopt are often called the laggards, but often it doesn't get to the laggards. So partial adoption is actually much more common than full adoption of technologies. So you find a lot of technologies that are only used, depending on what your location is in a country, by just 20% or 30% of the farmers. On a region, even a small region, you might not have 100% of farmers using a certain technology. So the million-dollar question is, why is that? And does that have to do just with the fact that some are slower, or does it have other reasons? Here's an example from a study that looked at adoption rates of digital farming technologies. They looked at many more technologies, but I had to stuff it all into one slide. So I just show you some of them. So the study area was Bavaria. They looked mostly at small-scale farmers. And you see here that many of these technologies are actually only partially adopted. Some more people are planning to adopt. But the question is, will we actually eventually get to 100%, or will we stay somewhere in the middle? And various factors contribute to where we end up in the end. And I just want to give you a few examples to appreciate how complex it can become. So one explanation for partial adoption is context heterogeneity. So think of the distribution of soil types in Germany. If you look at this map here on the right, you see that there are soils with very low yield potential and soils with a very high yield potential. So in the center of Germany, you have soils that have a comparatively high yield potential. So if you then look at a certain technology and how it gets adopted across Germany, you might see that it only gets adopted on the very productive soils or the not so productive soils, depending on what type of technologies it is. And that might have to do with the fact that soil quality variations imply variations in the degree of profitability of that particular technology. So context heterogeneity, and we're just looking at Germany here, think of the whole world as the potential field of application for robotics and sensing technologies. There's a lot more heterogeneity in context than we see on this map. Another explanation is that we have farms that have different characteristics. So we can have small farms and large farms. This is an example from a study done in the UK, looking at the production costs of field crop production in conventional, using conventional and autonomous technologies. And you see here that the unit costs of production, they decrease as the farm size increases, and also the relationship between the costs for conventional and autonomous equipment changes depending on farm size. Now here it looks as if the autonomous equipment is always more profitable or less costly, at least, as the conventional equipment. But another study by the same group of researchers shows that this depends a lot on the regulations that are in place. So in some parts of the world, you need a human supervisor for the autonomous equipment, and then the unit production costs are higher than for the conventional equipment. This brings me to the next example. So farm type and regulations affecting farms in a different way do affect whether farmers are willing to pay more or less for new technologies here. This is work currently being done in CP6. we compared an organic and a conventional farm type, and the willingness to pay these different farm types would have for autonomous weeding equipment. And clearly the organic farms are willing to pay much more than the conventional farms, which has to do, of course, with the requirement of them not being allowed to rely on chemical fertilizers. So mechanical weeding using some autonomous equipment is much more interesting and attractive for an organic farm than for a conventional farm, unless some other regulation is put in place that changes the rules of the game. So looking at the legal setting is also something that needs to be taken into account. So it seems as if we would have to move from our simple profitability framing towards somewhat more complicated framing. And perhaps this one, even though it looks a bit more complicated, is a more realistic framing. So we could think of adoption being, a probability that depends on various factors or predictors. If you think of this as a regression equation, could be context factors that are valid for a certain farm I in a certain region. It could be farm characteristics of that farm, the specific type of the farm, and that's the next part of my talk. It could be behavioral factors. So in the early days, economists were mostly thinking about profitability and all the different factors that affect profitability. But in recent years, one of the most popular topics in economics is the behavioral aspects of human decision-making. And behavior does add quite some layers of complexity also to the adoption story. The thing is that adoption decisions are made based on expected profits. So we don't know yet how many profits we will make when we adopt technology. There's uncertainty involved, prices go up and down, interest rates go up and down when we need credit. And so it's all about understanding the expectations of farmers when they make decisions about the use of one or the other technologies. And expectations of all of us, not only farmers, depend on how much experience we have in a certain field. It depends on our norms and beliefs, and it depends on individual psychological traits that are sometimes very hard to measure. This is the picture here on the right is from the graphical abstract of a study that showed that actually the land use of farmers that are embedded in large social networks differs quite a bit from the land use of farmers who are operating in a more isolated social setting. Yeah? So social network or your social networks affect your expectations about many things. And in the case of farmers, they affect your expectations about profitability and also your attitudes towards a new technology. There's a nice study from the Midwest in the US that looks at church mergers in the 20th century and how these church mergers led to variation in the size of farmers' social networks. Then these researchers studied what happened on the farms of these farmers in these different counties of the US. And they found that in counties with church mergers, meaning in countries where the social networks through these mergers of churches of farmers, of some farmers increased significantly. Also the fertilized acreage, so the use of fertilizers increased by 13% compared to farming areas in counties without mergers. So this happened in one of the most important farming areas of the US in the Midwest, and of course had quite an important effect on profitability, on yields, on labor, employment in agriculture, and probably also on the environment. So here you see a good example of how social network effects can have a bearing on what type of technologies are adopted and also the impacts that follow from that. Yeah? So just to have an intermediate conclusion here, we could call that a PILS insight. And I learned in many exchanges with our colleagues from other CPs that predicting crop yields is a very complex undertaking. So if you're a natural scientist and thinking about how difficult it is to predict crop yields, it's about as difficult as predicting adoption rates. So we are dealing with very different but equally complex traits and dynamics here that we need to understand, and we do that looking at theory. We need data and models, and we can still get it wrong because we haven't understood all the important aspects that play a role in predicting adoption rates. Now let's look at how this can be done in practice, and actually how we do it also in CP6. So I think it helps to differentiate between two settings. So we can look at adoption of technologies that are already in use. Here you see a broadband spraying technology, and we can look at who uses that technologies and observe the use of these technologies in so-called observational studies. We could also create some experiments. We could work with technology providers and propose that some technologies are only offered to some types of farmers and others to others. That would be a randomized experiment in the real world. And then we could look at how the different technologies are adopted or not, and maybe combined with different subsidies or so. Try to understand how policy interventions could affect the adoption rates. We could learn from that, and then we could use this information to fill it into process or data-driven models, and then also predict how the adoption might play out in the time to come. This is, of course, convenient because we can see how these technologies already are used in practice. Now, in PhenoRob, we are dealing with many technologies that are not yet in use, and that means some of these approaches cannot be used anymore. We are not observing a lot of use of these technologies in practice. There might be so-called precursor technologies that have similar characteristics, but they are not necessarily autonomous. So also the randomized experiments in the real world do not really work. So what we do instead, for example, is a hypothetical or so-called framed experiment where we confront a decision maker, a farmer, for example, with choices between alternative types of technologies. And we, of course, can then use that information also in process and data-driven modeling, but that implies making many more assumptions about all sorts of things like the costs of the technologies and the functionality of the technologies and things like that. So there are a couple of caveats involved in studying the potential of future adoption of technologies that are still in the development phase. Now, I want to give you a couple of examples of these different approaches and illustrate a bit how this could work. Let's start with the observational studies. So we always, as economists and social scientists, and probably as scientists in general, start from formulating some theoretically motivated hypotheses based on the state of the art. We would then go as economists and collect data on observed adoption. That means running a farm survey or looking at census data that hopefully records technology adoption. That is not the case in many countries. So often we don't have that data and have to collect it ourselves. Sometimes we are lucky and have some remote sensing data that helps us to infer on technology adoption, but that's not always possible. Once we've done that, we would do some statistical analysis and can here apply quite complex technologies called methodologies called quasi-experimental methods. But all these studies have a fundamental problem. And if you want to know more about that, you can look at Hugo Storm's PILS lecture. And the problem is called the fundamental problem of causal inference. So we can, in these cases, not be sure that adopters we observe today and the non-adopters we observe today were similar before they adopted these technologies. So we cannot control who adopted and who didn't, because it's a voluntary decision. We could only do that if we have a randomized experiment, and often we weren't there when the technology started to be adopted and weren't able to run an experiment. And secondly, of course, the technology adoption could affect the way the farmers respond to our survey questions, and all that leads to bias in the statistical analysis that we then do to understand which factors contributed to the adoption. All of these methods have issues, but here's an example of an observational study looking at variable rate nitrogen applications. And some researchers had already shown that these technologies are in principle on an average farm profitable. So the more soil information and sensor information you include in the system, the more profitable it becomes. So a standard cost-benefit analysis, the one we showed in the beginning, suggests that variable rate nitrogen application increases profits if you adopt it. But then a former colleague of ours, Wilke Hüttel, did a study on this, talking to a number of farms in Germany and trying to understand what led them to adopt these technologies. And what they found out is that the cost aspect, or the ease of use aspect, didn't seem to play much of a role in explaining why some farmers adopted these technologies and others not. In fact, what they found is that variation in the adoption is mostly explained by social norms. And social norms are things that you sort of deduct from your peers or your networks. So you look at your farm advisor or your neighbor, and you see what they seem to think is the right thing to do. And then you do it as well, or not, depending on whether you agree or have a good relationship with your neighbors and advisors or not. So social norms, in a way, are a very important aspect, and we have to understand how they are formed and how they are transformed over time, also through interaction of farmers in their networks, right? So here's another example of a framed experiment looking at technologies that are not necessarily already in use. Again, we start by formulating some sort of hypotheses. We then create a hypothetical randomized choice scenario. So we basically confront farmers with a toy farm, let's say 50 hectares, on which they can decide which weeding technology to use. And ideally, and that's not being done in all studies, but in our studies, it was possible because we have the funding from PhenoRob. We could actually provide these choices with real payoffs. So we could say, if you choose this technology, you get a certain amount as an individual profit. If you use another, your individual profit will be lower, but you can do something for the environment by donating money to an NGO, for example. So of course, the real payoffs are lower than the payoffs in reality, but still they increase the likelihood that the participants of the experiment will behave in a more or less rational way. Now, we do this then in a survey or lab experiment to collect these behavioral data from, in this case, farmers, and then we feed this into, again, a statistical analysis. But now there is another key issue. So now we have perhaps solved the problem of causal inference, but we have to deal with people who might be behaving somehow differently in this hypothetical setting. Their so-called gambling behavior, because it's not about so much money. People have, in these experiments, especially when they do this on their computer, a limited attention span, so you have to make the story very simple to the extent that you're oversimplifying the real-world setting. And that, of course, means that you can only learn about how people approximately behave in the real world, depending on how much simplification, how much gambling behavior you have in such an experiment. So here's again an example from our own work in CP6. So we let roughly 340 farmers choose between alternative weeding technologies for their hypothetical farm. And we varied the individual and environmental payoffs. Those were real payoffs. So farmers could actually earn some money or donate some money for environmental purposes. And we also had some randomized treatments. So one randomly selected group of farmers was offered a subsidy to adopt a new technology, in this case, the weeding robot, and another group didn't. Now, what we found is that the subsidy didn't have much of an effect on whether farmers chose one or the other technology. So BB here is broadband spraying, SS means spot spraying, and WR means weeding robot. And you see that here on the right-hand side, the only two factors that really mattered are attitudes toward the environment. So we measured the farmers' attitudes towards environmental protection, and the PI means the personal innovativeness. So how innovative is a farmer? These factors contributed to reduced adoption rates of broadband spraying and increased adoption rates of alternative methods, and sometimes in favor of the weeding robot and sometimes in favor of spot spraying. spraying. So adding return to new technology by subsidizing it does not necessarily increase the adoption rate if attitudes and other social or behavioral aspects somehow speak against doing this or speak in favor of doing this. Then this, of course, can have an effect in the different direction. Now, these are two experiments of basically trying to study this in terms of collecting data and doing statistical analysis. The big challenge is then to move from understanding the relationships to modeling them. And I think that's also something that other colleagues in other core projects and PhenoRobs are dealing with. How do we move from data-driven to process-based modeling? And that's, of course, also a challenge in economics, just that we are dealing with a slightly different problem setup. So technology adoption is a result of human decision-making. That was the whole point of the first part of the presentation. In economics and social sciences in general, we do have competing models of human decision-making. So I guess in plant sciences, for example, many relationships are theoretically clear. Perhaps there are not so many different or competing models of how something could work than in the social sciences. That's to be discussed. But here's an example on the right-hand side of a study that looked at the different theoretical approaches used in modeling land use change. And you see here, and this is really summarizing many more, there's a huge number of different ideas about how humans make decisions. And that's why in the social science, it's very important, and it's actually part of the actual research process, that you motivate well why you are choosing one or the other decision-making theory. And this is just to illustrate that perhaps this is a slightly different way of approaching science than in many of the natural sciences, because we really need to defend and explain how we think about decision-making. I want to give you one example from a piece of work that's being done by our colleagues at AI Farms, Madhukana and her team. They looked at a bioeconomic model, so they're combining biological dynamics with decision-making. And here, the biological dynamics are in weed resistance dynamics. So we all know spraying can over time lead to resistances of some weeds. The more resistance you have, the less profitable is your spraying technology. So what they did is they combined different types of decision-making modes. A myopic farmer who just thinks about the next year, and a forward-looking farmers that takes into account future weed pressures, for example, and also future costs and benefits. And what they show is that some of these farmers, especially the forward-looking farmers, are likely to be the early adopters of mechanical weeding robots, but not necessarily the ones that adopted on the whole farm. Yeah, so you learn something about who is likely to adopt. That helps, for example, technology providers to target certain parts of the farming population to start distributing or disseminating their technologies. And that, of course, then also can, via social network effects, for example, lead to more adoption by the latecomers or those who are operating in a more myopic way. So this would be, I would say, the high art of actually combining what we learned from these empirical studies into models. And of course, in CP6, we're also working on models that can do these kinds of analyses and allow us to actually compare different ways of decision-making against each other and combine this with biological dynamics. And I actually want to close with maybe 3 bullet points that I would call the frontiers in research on the adoption of agri-robots, and that also perhaps help us to think about future fields of collaboration. So I think what we need to do is to understand better which context and farm level factors matter for which sensing and robotics applications. We now have sort of zoomed into one technology in one certain setting, and we have looked at what that might mean for adoption. but there are many more context realities that might matter. And of course, we can't do research on all of them, but we would like to get some understanding of which factors are really important and which factors are less important. As robotics and sensing technologies become commercially available, we could also slowly move from framed to real-world experiments. Actually, we have been able to do one real-world example already in CP6. So basically, the future is moving to the field and trying to work with farmers who are early adopters of these new technologies. And finally, I think we could think more about integrating, of course, data-driven and process-based models in our own disciplines, but then also across disciplines. And that's where I think the art of interdisciplinary collaboration starts. We need to think about how we simplify our models in our disciplines so that they can be combined. So building a bioeconomic model means cutting back on detail in biophysical relationships, but also cutting back on detail in economic relationships. And each problem might require different trade-offs between the two. And that's, I think, where natural scientists, engineers, and economists could come together in PhenoRob. And with this, I'm done with my talk and look forward to your questions.